nervous. Okay, are you ready? Hi everybody, and welcome to the Halfie Project channel. My name is Becky, and welcome back to another session of Let's Talk. So today I thought that we could discuss the topic of terms. And I feel like the more that we do videos or the more interviews that we have, the more discussions in podcasts, and also importantly, the comments that we get from you guys kind of reveals what is more like the current temperature or the general opinions that people have on certain terms used to define themselves. Now, I know it's kind of sticky territory because we have on one hand some people who would say, I don't want to pigeonhole myself into something. I don't believe in terms. I don't believe in calling myself one thing or another. I'm just me, which is very legitimate. But also on the other hand, we know historically, politically, culturally, in society, pretty much in all aspects of life, we have ourselves defined in some way or another. And all of that is tied into searching for your identity. Why? Because you're trying to identify yourself, to define yourself, to decide what does me mean. And that comes with terms. And terms do have power because it's how you are relating to the outside world. How can they view you? If you want to be totally nameless, stateless, nothing, and you just expect people to just accept you and understand you as you are, that's really quite a high demand. And so this is why we have to deal with terms. And the other thing that I wanted to bring up with the issue of terms is that the power of a term does not exist in the word itself. It exists in the power that people give to that word. So I guess thing that comes to mind, a rose by any other name would still smell as sweet. Why? Because it is the quality that whatever it is we're calling a rose contains. And I think it's the same thing when we're talking about terms used to define ourselves. I'm gonna go into a bit more detail here. We obviously give ourselves at this channel a very distinct word to describe ourselves. We call it the Halfie Project, right? And of course, when the Halfie Project was first launched, and still to today, we do have people who really take offense with that word. Halfie. Why would you call myself Halfie? Why would you say that I'm half this, half that? And I thought it would be important for us to discuss, one, the background of the term Halfie, why we came to use that word, and the power that we are giving that term, because that is very, very important here. I guess before we get into that, we gotta backtrack a little bit, and we have to look into the other terms that have been used to describe mixed Koreans and other mixed race people. So of course, in Korea, we have the term 혼혈. If you look at it from the Chinese character breakdown, 혼혈, this would mean literally mixed blood, which in itself doesn't have negative connotation, right? When we're saying it in English. But if you look historically in the context of 혼혈, it was very derogatory. It could also contain the contexts, or I guess the subcontexts, the surrounding meaning society gave to it, to mean dirty blood or half caste or some mixed breed, something like this. So even though the term itself didn't indicate anything negative, it was the power given to the word. So there's still people today who reject the term 혼혈. They fought really hard. I don't want to be 혼혈. We're not 혼혈, because we just wanted to be Korean. We are trying to shed off a term given us because of its negative connotations to accept a term that is societally accepted. Another thing is language. Language is simply a vehicle to express meaning. Same thing, words. And I just felt like the term 혼혈 was, though perhaps more accurate when we're talking about mixed Koreans specifically, it did also, in a way, shut out some people who didn't speak Korean, or some people who didn't have any kind of emotional connection to the word 혼혈. And another thing, which is a bit more superficial, is that there are going to be people who simply wouldn't have interest in it because 혼혈 is not English. And this is just an unfortunate fact, but I thought that using the word 혼혈 specifically for this project might limit the scope of people we could reach. The other thing is that Halfie, it didn't attach a certain or specific ethnicity to the term. So outside of, let's say, Hunhyol or some other common terms, Hapa, Hafu, right? They tend to be specifically attached to a certain ethnicity. Otherwise, we would just use the word half Korean, which also is accurate, but there are half Koreans from all over the world who would fit in this subculture of half Korean, but maybe they relate stronger to being German, or maybe to American, or to Kazakh. And in a way, by stating I'm half Korean, it's sort of separating yourself based on your ethnicity, rather than having one commonality. So attaching a certain ethnicity to the term half something, it's sort of crowded out other cultures or ethnicities, which is also a defining factor of who you are, of who I might be. So case in point, I had a friend who said when he came to Korea, he was more quickly embraced by Koreans when he defined himself as half Korean as opposed to half his other ethnicity, even though he carried more physical traits of his other ancestry. So this was sort of indicative of the power of a term or the power of a word. And it didn't feel quite fair to me to eliminate one part of you or emphasize another part of you when you are equally both things. So I think the thing with finding a term to define ourselves or some term to define a person of mixed race ancestry that would not be so, vague and thrown out there that you can't create a sense of community, but also nothing so limiting or strictly defined that you would be cut off from other aspects of who you are. It was a little bit tricky, to be honest, and I wanted to find a term that would allow whichever nationality to have a sense of belonging and still retain this aspect of being multicultural or multi-ethnic. Something that we get all the time, and something that I always notice, is using the term Hapa. And we actually released a podcast where we dive more into the history and the cultural implications of using the term Hapa. And by no means, I'm no person here to judge somebody who wants to use this term to define themselves or that term to define themselves. I think it's just a little bit tricky when it comes to mixed race, because when we look at the cultural or historical backgrounds, and this will be different depending on which country or history that you're looking at. But most typically, there has not really been a term existing for a sense of community that doesn't hold some sort of derogatory inflections. So circling back to Hapa, it's also a bit of an interesting case. Because Hapa itself, the term itself is, I believe it's the pidgin transliteration of the Korean or the English word half, and it's become Hawaiian. But Hapa just quickly means in part, and judging on the extra word you attach to it could mean half or quarter, part this, part foreigner, part white, right? And I'm no expert in the Hawaiian language, so some of you guys will probably know a lot better than me. It was kind of also utilized later on by Japanese Americans by finding a term to describe themselves in the American scape, but to separate themselves from first gen or second gen Japanese Americans and reference that they were only part Japanese and to give themselves this term to rally around. And I didn't really resonate with the word Hapa myself. So even though it's become very widely used or commonplace in just the regular discourse that people have in their daily lives, oh, I'm Hapa, she's Hapa, and it doesn't initially have a negative, connotation, there is still some discussion over, well, is it fair or is it right to use this word to describe yourself? You can look into the podcast for a bit more of my opinions on that. So, this was something else I took into mind. I realized, well, I'm not Hawaiian. I don't have Hawaiian background, and I'm also not Japanese. I don't have Japanese background. I wonder what it could be. So the trouble still existed that there's not really a term that can allow pride in being mixed race and not being associated to one sort of ethnicity and also not having negative connotations. What would be a possible term for that? And so as you can imagine, it's kind it's kind of a tricky but also narrow situation, right? And so we thought a lot about that, and I still think a lot about that. To be honest, I mean, there's still times where I'll read comments and I'll be like, gosh, using the word Halfie can also offend some people. But on the other hand, I'll talk with someone else and be like, wow, I never had a term to describe myself. Halfie's perfect. So this is kind of an issue when you have this springing of middle ground people who are not granted access to this term or that term and sort of shunted aside, or even worse, giving very demeaning terms. And why would you want to rally behind that? Why would you want to establish a sense of identity in something that puts you down in the word context itself? And the other hand that I find really interesting lately is when we have people, primarily our Korean subscribers, who will kind of raise up the point, why do you use the term 혼혈? You're just Hanguk인 anyway. You're Korean, so why do you call yourself 혼혈? Why do you have to define yourself by 혼혈? I imagine that one day in the future, the term 혼혈, or emphasizing your mixed Korean identity, it might not be significant someday in the far future. But I think at this point, to ignore the power that that term holds is to discount a lot of history and experience that people of mixed Korean ancestry have had and still have today. In a way, even though it can have negative connotations to some people, to dismiss it outright and establish like, you're not 혼혈, why do you even use that term? It might be painful to acknowledge for some people, but it is also ignoring or dismissing a part of who they are. And this, again, is another difficulty with terms, because 혼혈 itself didn't have to be a derogatory term. Half race didn't have to be a derogatory term. Half Korean didn't have to carry negative connotation in the past. But the fact remains is that it did. It was given power by the community or the society or that country or the governments, by the people around them. And so because it carried that power and because it carried that connotation and then was established on somebody, oh, you're half Korean, you're 혼혈, they carry that with them. And so now we see that it's kind of circled around, I think, from a very painful term to use to describe yourself to now almost a sense of pride. I believe that there's a lot of mixed Koreans like me who say proudly, I'm 혼혈. Why? The term itself didn't change, but it was the power given to the term. And I think this is something that's really important to remember when we're talking about ourselves in the grander context. How are people going to recognize you? How are they going to, what definition do you give yourself? And this is all part of this aspect of identity. And I also think it's totally okay for us to be wrestling with this idea of, how do I define myself? What am I going to be called? What am I? It's okay to ask those questions. I think it's totally reasonable. And I also think it's just really difficult to work through because there's a whole lot of factors at play here. So in the end, we used the word Halfie. I felt it was pretty neutral. I didn't think it was, related specifically to one culture or one aspect or ethnicity or country. And I thought it was friendly, honestly. And I also felt like the term Halfie, even if maybe it could make you feel uncomfortable or some people don't want to acknowledge that, it does also sort of send this feeling of one foot in and one foot out. Because even if we like to say, I'm full 100% Korean and full 100% American, that itself is true. But this is the weird clashing of understanding that can exist when it comes to defining mixed race. Because you could just say, yeah, I'm just mixed race flat out. Or you could say, well, I openly recognize that I am part this and part that. And I think it can be really difficult to be 100% this and 100% that because you can only grow up in one country, right? You can only have the full experience of, let's say, a German kid growing up in Germany. And could you also repeat that exact same experience growing up in Korea from day one? It's just physically not possible unless, someone makes a time machine or something like that. The important thing to recognize is that it's not a bad thing. It's not a negative thing to say, I'm half this, I'm half this, I'm halfie. There's no negativity in that. Why? Because it's the power that you give to the term. It's the power that we as a community give that term. And so this is what we're trying to do. This is what it is, this discussion. Deciding, okay, what's the term? What's the power we give it? How do we want the outside world to see us? And so maybe someday in the future we won't have those terms. Maybe we won't. Maybe the Halfie Project, it's not even gonna matter except for archival purposes. But for now, this is the topics that we have because I believe it's important and I recognize it's important to you guys. And for people who aren't mixed, it's also important for you. How do we see ourselves and how do we fit into this grander community called the world? So just as a final point, Halfie itself was never designed to insinuate you are just a half a person, you're not a whole being. I don't believe that's it. Honestly, I feel like when it comes to mixed race, mathematically it doesn't make sense, but I never said I was a mathematician. 1 + 1 = 1. And you're full this, you're full that, you're full one person. Nobody's trying to cut you in half or cut you down. And so here at the Halfie Project, I just think this is a dynamic that we're playing with and how to define ourselves in this search for identity. So does it seem too vague? Maybe. I think that's the great and difficult thing about being half this or half that, or mixed race or mixed culture. And that's what we're trying to explore and to reveal to ourselves and to the world around us. And it's okay to feel different. It really is. The community of half Koreans exists. It's just we're a little separated at the moment. And that's why we're here trying to create this space. And you know what? You don't have to feel obligated to fit in with one side or the other because you are you. And you should be accepted for who you are. And I think that's enough. So thank you for watching the Halfie Project. I'd love to hear your comments below. I'd love to hear what you guys think about the term halfie. Some people love it, some people don't. And that's totally okay because it's the power that you give the term. And here, we give it a positive connotation. Also, you can let me know some other terms. I can't say I know everything about being mixed race, and I'd love to hear your own experiences. So leave a comment below and subscribe to the Halfie Project channel. And also make sure you get in touch. If you have anything you'd like to say, thehalfieproject@gmail.com. We are the Halfie Project.